So essentially this waste problem that we're facing in Africa, what does it look like? Where are we? Where do we expect things to go? And if you look at the Africa Waste Management Outlook that was published in 2018, let me just get my pointer. You can see in the graph on the left-hand side here that sub-Saharan Africa is really expected to undergo exponential growth in waste management, this dotted line, and we're only sitting around about here at the moment in 2020. So Africa is really expected to undergo a major transformation over the coming century, and the reason for this is we're expected to see massive population growth on the continent, urbanization of cities, with a number of big mega cities emerging on the continent, and obviously a growing middle class. Greater spend means, increasing consumer purchasing habits. And as I said, this is expected to lead to exponential growth in waste management. And in fact, this growth is so significant in the amount of waste we're expected to generate that it almost doesn't matter what other regions in the world are doing with regards to waste management. We will not see peak waste generation before 2100 because of what is happening in Africa. Now, I suppose one could say, well, maybe this is not necessarily a bad thing. Africa needs development, it needs growth, and we know that there's a direct correlation between waste generation and GDP. So, is this necessarily a bad thing? The problem is though, that the current infrastructure and systems that we have in place can't cope with the existing waste management. So if you look at, photos like this are not unusual for Africa. This particular photo was taken by a colleague in Kenya. And the trouble is that, we're sitting with broken waste collection systems. It's estimated that only around 55% of the municipal solid waste that is generated in Africa is actually collected. And often we see these images of waste just being dumped in open spaces on the side of the road, and this creates, significant human health and environmental impacts. The other problem as well is that around 90% of the waste generated in Africa is disposed of to land, and typically these are to uncontrolled or controlled dump sites. Images like this as well. No compaction, no cover. And again, these kind of dump sites attract vermin. We know that there's a direct correlation between living in close proximity to these dump sites and diseases like malaria, cholera, Zika, for example. And so, this mismanagement of waste at end of life has a huge potential for environmental and human health impacts. Open burning is another one that really plagues developing countries, not only Africa, but developing countries around the world, whether it be intentional or unintentional burning of waste as a management practice. The open burning of waste causes, again, significant air quality impacts, air pollution impacts, which impact on human health. And as you can see in the photo here, people living in close proximity to these dump sites where there's regular, often daily burning of this waste in terms of managing it. So there really is a significant waste management problem facing the continent currently. In addition, what we're seeing is new types of waste streams emerge within our landscape. This is a photo of waste diapers, of disposable nappies, which is becoming a huge problem in Africa at end of life. And, we don't have adequate end-of-life solutions. If you look at those previous slides, with only 55% of the waste collected, 90% of the waste going to these uncontrolled or controlled dump sites, very often this waste is just dumped in open spaces in close proximity to where people live. We don't have appropriate end-of-life solutions to deal with not only sort of just the simple waste streams like organic waste or food waste, but now we've got these complex materials, diapers that have got, nappies, different kinds of fibers, for example, in them as well. The other problem is that Africa is essentially becoming a dumping ground for waste streams from developed countries, from the global north. We're seeing this for electronic waste, for example, but also we're seeing it for clothing waste. And there's a really, really interesting video documentary which I love to show my students, that was released in 2019. It's called The Dirty Business with Old Clothes, and it speaks about how the donation of clothing in Europe, for example, these clothes find their way into Africa, and how they have disrupted and often decimated local textile and clothing industries in many African countries, for example. In fact, Oxfam estimate that more than 70% of clothes donated globally end up in Africa. And yes, there are benefits in that obviously people in Africa now have, access to cheaper clothing, for example. It saves in just dumping these in the global north. But as I said, there are a number of negatives to this as well. For example, disrupting local economies. And I'm not going to show the video now. I've provided you with the link there, but I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at this video. The other one, which perhaps, a little bit more humor to it as well, is a 2019 Netflix release called The Ugly Truth of Fast Fashion. And again, I've provided the link there for you, but I'd encourage you to go and listen to it in terms of, this flood that we're facing as a continent in terms of, increasing consumer spend, changing habits in terms of, purchasing clothing, how we consider clothing, cheap clothing, for example. And I'd encourage you to have a look at that video as well. And I think as a result of these changing consumer patterns, the clothing and textile industry has really appeared quite a lot in headlines in the media over the last year or two. I mean, I've just included some on the left-hand side there from Bloomberg, from the World Economic Forum, for example, talking about the environmental crisis that we're starting to see appear with this fast fashion that's facing us globally. And one of the reasons for this, as you can see down on the left-hand side here, is if you compare prices of different products, the price of clothing has remained or has perhaps not increased at the same price that other things, like food, for example, other items has increased. And this has resulted in clothing remaining quite cheap. And as a result, really encouraging this fast fashion, this increased sort of purchasing of clothing. The figures on the right-hand side, globally, clothing production has doubled from 2000 to 2014. The number of garments purchased per capita between 2000 and 2014 has increased by about 60%. And the result of this is because obviously a lot of energy goes into the production of these materials. A lot of them are synthetic textiles, so coming from oil, from plastics, with a significant carbon footprint. And so the fashion industry is estimated to account for around about 10% of global carbon dioxide output, which I've found quite staggering, is actually more than all international flights and shipping combined. So the clothing and textile industry really has a significant environmental footprint. And as I said, a lot of that is coming from synthetic materials. So in fact, fashion accounts for around about 20% of the 300 million tons of plastic produced. And I think this is going to get worse before it gets better, because we know the backlash that we're seeing globally around single-use plastic, your plastic bags, your straws, your disposable cutlery and crockery, for example, made out of plastic. And so if countries are starting to put bans in place, we've seen a number of African countries put bans in place around, plastic carrier bags, but other single-use plastic items. The plastics industry is obviously going to be looking for other off-take markets. And if fashion, if textiles, if clothing is seen as an attractive market, a growing market, it's seen as an opportunity for the plastic sector to redirect their product away from single-use plastics into kind of more durable synthetic materials. So again, it's something that we really have to be cautious about in terms of going forward, this, the whole issue around plastics and plastics consumption and wastage. What's also very concerning is, I mentioned earlier on this growing middle class that we're seeing on the African continent, and greater sort of ability to spend and to purchase. And McKinsey recently published a very interesting study that looked at what are the implications of this growing middle class. And the figures on the left-hand side, they show the increases in environmental impact if 80% of emerging markets achieve Western per capita consumption levels. So what happens if we do start to consume as colleagues have in the global north? What are the impacts of that? And you can see, for example, 77% increase in CO2 emissions expected just in a 10-year period, 20% increase in water use, 7% land use increase. So, really significant environmental impacts if we start to act, if we start to consume as the global north has done. And so it's really, it's one of the things I think that sort of keeps me awake at night is how do we as Africa respond to our own development going forward? Because we have to grow, we have to develop, we have to improve livelihoods on the continent. But we have to rethink how we do that. How do we consume? How do we dispose in Africa? Because if we don't do things differently as Africa, we really face a potential environmental, social, and economic crisis because the current systems that we have in place are broken. They're broken already, and so to add to that problem could essentially overwhelm us. So is there a way of doing things differently in Africa as we develop? Can we leapfrog that we don't repeat and make the same mistakes that those in the global north have done? Now, the circular economy is perhaps one model that we can consider in helping us move closer towards sort of a more sustainable future, a more sustainable growth path. We're very much, not only just in Africa, but globally, we're very much embedded in this very linear economy of we extract resources, we take them, we make things, we sell them through retail, we consume them, and then we dispose them. And so it's very much this kind of take, make, and dispose, this very linear economy, which is why we end up with these huge waste streams that are finding their way to landfill sites and to dump sites. Now, the circular economy is not about doing this just more sustainably. The circular economy is really disruptive. It says, how do we keep our resources circulating within the economy? And whatever sector that might be in, whether you're producing, vehicles, whether you're producing clothing, whether you're producing chemicals, how do we keep these materials flowing within the economy that we're not disposing of them to dump sites? Now, there are a number of definitions around the circular economy, but the one thing that I always like to stress is that the circular economy is not about waste management. The circular economy is about sustainable resource management. So how do we use our resources more efficiently, more effectively? How do we design our products to be, less resource intense, for example? It aims to decouple our economic growth from natural resources. So if you think about the clothing or textile industry, is there a way that we can provide affordable, quality clothing to people in a less resource intensive way that uses less water, less energy, less materials? And it's really about keeping materials in flow within the economy for as long as possible at their maximum value. And we can unpack those in more detail through Q&A later if you'd be interested. And I came across this very interesting diagram recently on social media in terms of what people think sustainable fashion is, and I just absolutely love this little image. On the left-hand side, we've got here it's spending a lot of money on sustainable brands, sustainable collections. It's kind of wearing these shapeless, earth-friendly, clothes and things like that. But what sustainable fashion actually is, it's about wearing the clothes we already own, thrifting, purchasing from sustainable brands, mending. I mean, how many of us, will mend or repair an item of clothing, or is it just, it's such an inconvenience that, and clothing is so cheap that in fact we'll rather just throw it away and go and buy a new item. What do we do with our clothing at end of life, for example? Do we use it for other purposes as opposed to just dumping it into the waste management system? And there was this lovely quote that accompanied this diagram on social media that says, you don't have to buy sustainable fashion, just use the clothes you already own and treat them well, because we already have too much stuff in our wardrobe. I just absolutely love that quote. So when it comes to the circular economy, and I've focused here just specifically around manufacturing and in this case around clothing, there are these three principles that relate to the circular economy. It's about designing out waste. So, how do we redesign our manufacturing processes, as I said, to use less material, less resources when we're actually producing. The sharing economy that I'll touch on a little bit more just now. Keeping materials in use, you can see the diagram on the left-hand side, kind of the circular flow of materials, but really importantly at the end of first life, what do we do with them? Can we refurbish? Can we repair them? Can we mend them? Can we remanufacture? Can we recycle? And essentially, before we have to just dispose of things, there are there are these loops and offtakes in terms of reusing for different purposes. Can we hand them down to to kids? As children grow, they grow out of clothing so quickly, passing them down to younger kids, passing them on to other families that may need, for example. So reusing, repairing, and if those have really reached the end of their life, then obviously into recycling. And there's some really innovative work that's happening globally, also on the African continent, around taking textile back into products and really keeping this cycle going. Because what we're wanting to do is to really kind of decrease the size of this arrow in terms of raw material extraction and input into this process. And once we have these resources within the economy, it's really about keeping them flowing and returning back into the system. And then the third principle is about, regenerate natural systems. So things like, if we're going to have this manufacturing process, what are the opportunities for renewable energy? The water that we use within our production cycles, can we treat that water and recirculate it within the local textile economy, for example? There's so many different business models around circularity, and we're seeing some really innovative business models appear in this space. Also within Africa, some innovative circular business models appearing. And I've got just a couple of examples that I've been fortunate to either meet the young entrepreneurs that have been working in this space, or have been told about them. So this was one that I came across that was actually working out of Europe, a young entrepreneur that started this, rethinking product design, which is right up front in the circular economy. And it really made me, I don't know if any of you have seen a little video, it's called The Story of Stuff. And I've included the YouTube video there as well. And I absolutely love this video about the story of stuff. And in it talks about the skinny heel, fat heel debate, about why in one season women's shoes have a skinny heel and in the next season they have a fat heel, and God forbid you should be seen in a fat heel season wearing a skinny heel shoe. And so it asks the question, well, why don't we have modular shoes where I can change the top, or I can change the bottom of the shoe, for example, and just sort of as fashions change, or depending on how I'm feeling in a particular day, I can actually mix and match my shoes up. And I just love this idea in terms of innovative design, in terms of having to buy a whole new shoe, for example. We also see examples of waste to fashion. So this was a young entrepreneur as well that I got to meet in Flanders, where they were taking waste dashboards from cars, the plastic, combining it with bamboo, other recycled materials. At that stage, they were actually looking at the potential for waste glass in terms of the lenses of the sunglasses, but essentially producing these sunglasses from waste streams. And he made the comment that they're not going to solve the waste problem by producing these sunglasses, but what it does is it helps to raise awareness amongst consumers in terms of their own consumer habits, their own waste that they're generating. So very often these fashion items can also become incredible communication and education pieces for consumers. Another young entrepreneur that I got to meet, I think he was working out of Belgium, if I'm not mistaken, or the Netherlands. It was essentially a leasing combined with recycling system of jeans, but essentially taking the denim, complete closed loop, denim back to denim, and I think they were working with colleagues in Italy around, natural dyes, for example. Respinning the fabric back into denim and making new pairs of denim jeans. And this was done through essentially a leasing business model where you didn't buy the jeans, you leased them, so that at end of lease, the clothing could be, brought back and either upcycled into, vintage jeans and sold on for a second or third use, or recycled back into new denim and new clothing production. The last one I want to speak to is just the sharing economy. If people are not familiar with this particular idea of the sharing economy as a subset of the circular economy. And the sharing economy really calls for complete disruption and a paradigm shift in terms of business as usual. It makes us rethink this whole sort of traditional model of ownership. So do I in fact need to own things? Do I need to own a car? Do I need to own my clothes? Or can I access them in a completely new business model, in a completely new way? So the sharing economy really speaks to this issue around resource sharing sharing, product as service, access over ownership. And in the diagram on the left-hand side there, I've included, just some of the businesses that we're seeing pop up in various of these sectors of the economy from a sharing economy perspective. And I think we're probably all familiar with the likes of, Uber as a ride share in the vehicle sharing space, but, Airbnb, for example, in the hospitality industry, and similarly in other areas of the economy, we're seeing the sharing economy idea, to the point that we're now seeing it appear also within the clothing sector. So Y Closet was actually started in China. There was a rental fee, and essentially you rented your wardrobe. So, at the moment now in South Africa, we're changing from summer into autumn. So, I would now hand my wardrobe back. It would be repaired. It would be dry cleaned. It would be fixed so that it's perfectly ready for, the next consumer who needs a summer wardrobe, and I would get my autumn wardrobe. Unfortunately, I've seen recently that this business closed just last year, and I want to go into this in a little bit more detail in terms of what was the reason for it. Is it, that it's incredibly difficult, I think, for some of these innovative startups that are facing huge constraints from a big traditional clothing and textile industry. And what was the reason for it closing? Was it just financially unsustainable, or were there other reasons as well? So it's really sad to see a lot of these innovative startup ideas having to close down. There are also niche markets, so there are a number of these, particularly, for children. I mentioned how quickly children can grow out of their clothing. For mothers, maternity wear, and again, for a small rental fee, you can essentially, rent your children's clothing, and when they've outgrown it, you return it, it's repaired, and, perfectly good then for the next consumer to use. Also, one that I came across recently, which is sort of more for the high-end rental clothing, sort of a shared designer closet. There are a number of these, and many of them have partnered with international hotels. Whether you're going on a business trip or a holiday trip, why do you need to pack clothing if you're going on a business trip? And I think, if I remember correctly, this one was in New York, where essentially you go online and you say, this is what I need. I need 2 suits, 3 blouses. And when you arrive in your hotel, your sort of designer clothes, business attire or holiday attire, whatever it is waiting for you in the closet. And when you leave, it's returned to the concierge, returned back to the company, and they dry clean, mend, etc. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of sharing ideas, sharing business models appear within the clothing sector to support various needs and various ideas. So just to conclude, and I could really spend an entire day talking about this. So if anyone wants to pick up discussions after this, whether it be today or later on, please do. But, I think the key things that I wanted to talk about is really Africa stands on this threshold of a waste crisis. I think we've already got one foot in it if we see some of these photos, and we really have to rethink how we consume, how we use our resources, and how we waste. Especially if you look at what's coming down the road in terms of increased consumption. We have to look at how we decouple our economic development from resource consumption. A circular economy is one way to do that. And the lovely thing about a circular economy, as you saw from some of those business models, is it creates socio-economic opportunities, innovative business models, innovative ideas. And the circular economy is really calling for disruption and innovation. And the circular economy is not a nice to have. We live on a planet of finite resources, and at some point in time, we will run out. And I always say to my young students, you will be the first generation that will start to experience the end of resources. And what does that world look like? What happens when we do run out of gold in the ground, or platinum in the ground, for example, or different materials, for example? So the circular economy requires this change in mindset, a change in mindset about how we view and how we use our resources, and also importantly, how we view ownership. So can we access goods and services in a completely different way? For me, it's clear that Africa's development cannot follow the unsustainable path that we've seen in the global north in terms of consumption and wastage. So how do we want to reinvent Africa's economy going forward? Because we have incredibly bright minds on the African continent, and I believe we can tackle this problem and do things differently so that we don't have to go down the same path as we've seen in developed countries. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. And sorry, I think I have gone over time slightly, but please feel free to engage further if you have any additional questions or comments. Thank you.
Oh, Linda, thank you so much. That was amazing.